All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Sorry for the few moment delay. Let us begin with a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Av. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shumer and Drushos this month in honor of their grandchildren. Tikva Esther, Simcha, Avigayil, Milana and Milicenta. May they grow to become the best version of themselves. The Daf Yomi share in the schus of refuah shalema for Yehuda Ben Michal. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, he together with Kol Cholei Yisrael have a complete and enduring refuah. And our week of learning sponsors, Bill and Raizy Eskin, L'zeicha nishmas, Bill's father Mordechai ben Dovid, and Raizy's mother Tzvyah Bas Moshe Aron. With Meretz Hashem, the neshama should have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And once again, the Shir Chevra for dedicating the week of learning in the schus of refuah shalema for Yehuda Ben Michal. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Daf Lamed. Some interesting sugyas ahead of us. We are picking up on Chav Testament base 29b, 10 lines up from the bottom. So the Gemara, Ula Rabbi Akiva. So just to reorient ourselves a bit, we started the new parak yesterday, and we are in the topic of kinas, the penalty payment in the situation where a man violates a woman. So remember again, the Mishnah pointed out the interesting novelty, where the din of kinas applies even if what? Even if we're talking about a situation with a woman whom a man is not permitted to marry. So the Mishnah went through a series of different examples of these types of women. So remember again, we ended off yesterday, or I should say, the last sugya that we did yesterday was the Gemara statement, Ula afuki mehai tana. The Gemara said that our Mishnah was coming to exclude the position of the following Tana. Which Tana? So the Gemara says, ultimately, again, the Gemara quoted the pasuk, "V'lo sihiya liisha." So the Gemara quoted the pasuk that said that if a man violates a woman, he is obligated to go ahead and marry her. So remember again, we had a machlokus, just to reorient a bit, we had a machlokus in Shimon HaTimni, or Shimon HaTimani, and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. So Shimon HaTimani said that it has to be Isha sheyesh ba havia, a woman literally again who a man is capable of marrying. Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya said Isha hara'uya lekaima, a woman who a man could remain married to. So the Gemara gave a whole bunch of nafkaminos, and now with that, Rabbi Akiva, Damar ein kiddushin tovsin b'chadei lavin, according to Rabbi Akiva, who said that kiddushin doesn't take effect with chayvei lavin. Rabbi, remember again, this is the unique position of Rabbi Akiva, whereas everyone else holds that in general, kiddushin takes effect with chayvei lavin. A woman who is prohibited to you by a lav, Rabbi Akiva says it does not. So according to Rabbi Akiva, also in kiddushin tovsin b'chadei lavin, my beinayu, then what would be the nafkamina between Shimon HaTimani and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya? Right? What would be the nafkamina? Ike beinayu almana lekohen gadol k'Rabbi Simai. The nafkamina between them would be the case of an almana who marries a kohen gadol, or in this case, an almana is violated by a kohen gadol, right? According to Rabbi Simai. Now, what did Rabbi Simai say? The Sanya, here we go. First of all, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Almana lekohen gadol, it's about 6 lines up from the Malam of Rashi. Now, what's unique about this case, about an almana to a kohen gadol? Leave aside the case of ones for just a moment. In general, there's something unique about the case of an almana marrying a kohen gadol. Namely, what Rashi says, the mode of Rabbi Akiva, shekidushin tovsin lo ba, v'af al pi shehi belav, ukrabi simai, v'adin grusha lehedyot. So it's actually quite interesting. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says that whereas we just said before that normally according to Rabbi Akiva, kiddushin is not tovsin b'chayvei lavin, there's one interesting exception to this rule, and that's the case of a kohen who marries, an almana, a kohen gadol who marries an almana. That's the exception to the rule. Even though that is halacha l'maisa, a lav, even Rabbi Akiva agrees that kiddushin is tovsin. What's the case? Here we go. The Sanyo, Rabbi Simai says, min hakol also Rabbi Akiva mamzerin. In general, Rabbi Akiva says that if you have a case of a marriage that's punishable by a lav, So Rabbi Akiva will say that such a union produces mamzerim. Chutz mi'almana lekohen gadol. There's an exception to this rule, and the exception to that rule is if a kohen gadol marries an almana. Why? Shaharet amra Torah, because the Torah itself says by such a union, lo yikach v'lo yichalal. The pasuk says he may not marry her, and he should not profane his offspring. What do you see from that? Says Rabbi Simai. Chilulin hu osa vein osin mamzerim. Halacha mais. What do you see from that? The Torah itself says, what does that union produce? That union produces chalalin and not mamzerim. So I just want to point out something very interesting here. So halacha l'maisa. So Rabbi Akiva, who normally holds that a union with an Isser Lav produces mamzerim, holds that there is one exception to this rule. The exception of an almana to a kohen gadol, where halacha l'maisa Rabbi Akiva will say the marriage works, but ultimately produces chalalin. Remember again, what's a chalal? A chalal is a kohen who essentially has an impacted status. He's not really a kohen. He's a chalal, therefore again, kind of has certain restrictions of the kahuna, but does not enjoy the rights of the kahuna. So therefore, also with the Gemara, just to come full circle, what the Gemara is suggesting is this would be a case of a nafkamina between Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. Because according to Shimon HaTimni, even according to Rabbi Akiva, a kohen gadol can marry an almana, albeit produce chalalin. But according to Shimon ben Menasya, this is not a marriage which is capable of enduring. In other words, the marriage could work, but it's not a marriage which could be sustained. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishavev da'amar, bo unitzavach Akiva ben Yosef, sheya omer, kol she'in lo bia b'Yisrael, havlad mamzer, my benayu. So I will say, so now, okay, so let's transition a little bit over here. According to Rabbi Yishavev, right, Rabbi Yishavev said we have to yell at Rabbi Akiva. Why should we yell at Rabbi Akiva? It's also interesting, bless you, it's also interesting that they referred to Rabbi Akiva not as Rabbi Akiva, but as Akiva ben Yosef. It's almost as if they're not calling him Rabbi Akiva out of a sense of displeasure with him. We have to come and yell at Akiva ben Yosef. Why? What did Akiva ben Yosef do wrong? Shaya Omer Kol She'in Lo Bia B'Yisrael Havlad Mamzer. Rabbi Akiva holds that essentially anyone whom you're not allowed to have relations with, if you have relations with them and have offspring, that offspring is a mamzer. Now, why do we have to yell at Rabbi Akiva? So Rashi says over here, Shemarbe mamzerim b'Yisrael chinam, because he is causing the proliferation of mamzerim for absolutely no reason. In other words, if you think about it, we've discussed this shita before because we've referenced it many times in Yavamis. It is a very strong position to hold that every single time there's an Isser Lav, halacha l'maisa, again, that results in mamzerus. That's a pretty overwhelming thing. So therefore, again, Rabbi Yishavev says we have to yell at Rabbi Akiva. Now, I will say the reason the Gemara is bringing this up is according to Rabbi Yishavev does not hold of the exception of Rabbi Simai. In other words, let's go back for just a moment. Rabbi Simai said that according to Rabbi Akiva, as much as Rabbi Akiva's position is any Isser Lav creates mamzerim, there's an exception to the rule. What's the exception to the rule? Right? Almana and a kohen gadol. Why? It's a drush on the pasuk v'lo yichalel. It only produces chalal and not mamzerim. According to Rabbi Yishavev, he rejects that, and he holds that according to Rabbi Akiva, any woman whom you're not allowed to have relations with produces mamzerim, which is wild. So every prohibited relationship, by definition, produces mamzerim. Apparently, even almana to kohen gadol. So according to that position, ultimately, again, my benai, we'll say once again, we're just trying to figure out a nafkamina between the positions of Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya. So according to this approach, what would be the nafkamina? To which the Gemara says, Ika benayo, top of Lamed of an Aleph, Chai ve'aseh mitzri ve'edomi. Oh, interesting nafkamina would be able to say, what about if you have a relationship that is only prohibited or only has an Isser Aseh? In other words, there's a positive commandment about the relationship. What's a good example about this? A Mitzri and an Edomi. Rashi says over here, Chai ve'aseh Mitzri ve'edomi, b'sok shlosha doros t'chsiv, dar shlishi yavo lahem. So we'll say it's interesting. If you have an Egyptian convert or an Edomite convert, what's the halacha? For the first 3 generations, they're not supposed to marry into the normal marriage pool, right? So the Torah phrases it as Dor Shlishi Yavo. The third generation is permitted to enter in. So we'll say this is what's called a Lav Haba Michlal Aseh, a prohibition which is gleaned through a positive commandment. In other words, there's no prohibition, there's just a positive commandment that says the third generation should marry into the Jewish people. So what do you see from such a statement like that? What do you see from such a statement? That the first two generations should not. So we'll say, interestingly enough, a union like this, so let's say somebody were to marry a first generation Edomite convert, so according to Rabbi Akiva, that would not produce mamzerim because there's no love. So this would be a good nafkamina between Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Shimon ben Asya. According to Shimon HaTimni, such a union can be affected. You can marry such a woman like this. But according to Rabbi Shimon ben Asya, ultimately what? Such a union cannot be sustained. So this makes sense according to Rabbi Yishavev, especially if he's coming to go ahead and reject the position of Rabbi Simai. This makes sense. But at the end of the day, if Rabbi Yishavev is just coming to advance his own opinion, so kol she'ein lo bia b'Yisrael havlad mamzer va'afilu chayve aseh. So then I will say, if that's the case, then maybe halacha l'maisa, the phrase of any woman with whom you're not permitted to have relations with, produces a mamzer. In other words, Rabbi say such a statement like that could be inclusive of what? Even chayve aseh. Maybe it comes to include even a situation like a Mitzri and Edomi convert, first or second generation. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, my beinahu, then once again, what would be the nafkamina between Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya? Ike beinahu bu'ula l'kohen gadol. This is interesting. So I'll say, an interesting nafkamina might be a kohen gadol who doesn't marry a besula, or better stated, a kohen gadol who marries a bu'ula. That could be a fundamental nafkamina as well. How so? I will say. So remember again, a kohen gadol who marries a bu'ula. So maishna dahabile asay she'ino shava bakol. So I will say this is interesting. So remember again, a kohen gadol has to marry a besula. Right? How do we know this? Because the Torah says v'hu isha bivsula ha'yikach. Once again, it's a positive commandment to marry a besula. So what happens if he marries a ba'ula, a woman who's not a basula? So he's in violation of a positive commandment. But yet, I will say, interestingly enough, this is very interesting, that this is an asay she'eno shava bakol, which means it is a positive commandment that does not apply to everyone. Who does it apply to? Only a kohen gadol. Now look at Rashi for just a moment. Umayshna Hai asay, mishar asay, the mode of Rabbi Akiva. Now, I will say, going back for just a moment. So this would be another good example of an asay that Rabbi Akiva. This would be, let me see differently. This would be another situation of a relationship where even Rabbi Akiva agrees does not produce mamzerim. Right? Why doesn't such a relationship produce mamzerim? Number one, because halacha l'maisa it's an asay. Number two, it's also further unique. What's also unique about it? It's an asay that is not shava bakol. It's an asay that is only applies to a kohen gadol. So Rashi, take a look at Rashi. Umayshna hay asay mishar asay demodeh Rabbi Akiva. Why is this case unique? Rashi says tahavele asay she'eno shava bakol she'eno noeg ela b'kohen gadol. So I'll say this is so. It's almost like there's two unique aspects here. Number one, it's an asay. Number two, it's an asay that only applies to a kohen gadol. Rashi says. So let's contrast this with, let's say, the asay that says you're only allowed to marry a third generation Edomite or Egyptian convert. That's an asay that applies to who? Applies to everyone. So it's just interesting. So again, just further kind of splicing the positions of Rabbi Akiva. Okay. Amar Rav Chisda. So we'll say, so that's the end of that sugya. So again, just to point out over here, the unique aspect we have in the Mishnah is that even though there are situations where halacha l'maisa, again, our Mishnah has the idea that one will be chayiv for violating a woman, even if it's a woman who you cannot marry. And all the Gemara just did right now is pointing out our Mishnah is not in alignment with every single opinion. Because there is a school of thought that says that Velo Sihya Leisha teaches me that only a woman who a man could marry, does he have an obligation to go ahead and pay the knas, pay the penalty payment if he violates her. And we had two different opinions of that. Shimon HaTimni, Rabbi Shimon Ben Menasya. Shimon HaTimni said that only a woman with whom you could effect kiddushin, if you violate her, do you pay knas? Rabbi Shimon Ben Menasya said, only a woman with whom you could have a sustained marriage, if you violate her, do you pay the knas? This whole sugya we did was just trying to figure out difference, nafkaminas, practical differences between their two opinions. The interesting part was we're trying to figure out the practical differences between their opinions, but what? Their opinions actually are not reflected in the Mishnah. Right? These are the two opinions with whom the Mishnah does not align. Because according to Shimon HaTimni and Rabbi Shimon Menasya, for example, if a man violates a mamzeres, is he chayiv to pay the knas? No. Why? Because according to Shimon HaTimni, you can't marry a mamzeres, right? I should take that back. In other words, technically, you can marry her. It depends on how you hold in Shimon HaTimni with Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Shimon Menasya, so let's say according to Shimon HaTimni, you would pay the knas, because halacha l'maisa, technically you could effect kiddushin with a mamzeres. According to Rabbi Shimon Menasya, it's an unsustainable marriage, therefore no knas. Okay. But bottom line is, these opinions are not really reflected in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah goes with the school of thought that even if you technically can't marry someone, either can't marry them because of Rabbi Akiva's position or an Isra Lav, halacha l'maisa, you're still chayiv for kinas. Good. That closes that out. Amar Rav Chisda, hakom modim b'bal anida shemishalim kinas. We'll say this is an interesting case. Everyone agrees that if a man violates a woman who is a nida, there is still a knas, there is still a penalty payment. Why? L'man da'amar yesh ba'haviyah, hanam yesh ba'haviyah. Because according to Shimon HaTimni, who says that ultimately, again, you have to be able to marry her. They say you can marry a woman who's in nida. Right? According to the opinion that says, which is Shimon Menasya, that it has to be a sustainable marriage. Ultimately, again, marrying a nida is a sustainable marriage as well. I will say b'haraya, right? The man's wife becomes a nida, the marriage doesn't suddenly become unsustainable. See, either way, the marriage would work, and therefore, Allah, if he violates a woman who is a nida, there is a knas. But I will say, this is fascinating, and this is going to open up our next sugya. Our Mishnah. So I'll say now we're switching gears a little bit. So remember again, the last part of the Mishnah brought up a very interesting case. Last case of the Mishnah was haba ala choso. Let's say a man goes ahead and violates chas v'shalom his sister, or all of these other erva situations. So remember again, what did the Mishnah say? Yesh lahem kinas. Yesh lahem kinas. Now, both sides, what was the common denominator amongst all of the arayas relationships at the end of the Mishnah? They're all punishable by kares. So what was the chiddush of the Mishnah? The chiddush of the Mishnah was that halacha l'maisa, we hold to the concept of kimle b'derabamine, which is, when you perform an act which generates dual liability, a death sentence, and financial liability, we dispense with the financial liability in the face of the death sentence. You get the more severe punishment. The chiddush of the Mishnah was that din only applies to death in the hands of a human court. Right? Death by a beis din. But if you chayiv kares, which is bidei shamayim, we don't go ahead and impose that concept of kimle b'derabamine, that you only get the more severe punishment. Rather, you get kares, and what? In this case, he'll also pay the fine. So therefore, if a man violates his sister, even though what he did is punishable by kares, halacha l'maisa, he's still subject to the fine, to the knas. So the Gemara says, "Ulafuki mit Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana." Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. What does Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana say? Here we go. The Sanya, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, haya oses Yom Kippurim ki Shabbos letashlumin. This is fascinating. Nechunya ben Akana said, Yom Kippur is just like Shabbos when it comes to repayment. I will say, what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. As Yom Kippur on the Shabbos, liftor hamadlik es hagadish Yom Kippurim kilu hidliku b'Shabbos. What does this mean? Ma Shabbos mischai b'nafsho pata minat tashlumin. At Yom Kippur, mischai b'nafsho patur min tashlum. So we'll say, remember again, I mentioned this yesterday's daf as well. Let's say a person goes ahead, right? Reuven goes over to Shimon's field, and he goes ahead and he lights a fire in Shimon's field, burning down Shimon's field. Totally burns down Shimon's field. So I will say, so now, what's the halacha? So remember again, when he burns down Shimon's field, there's two things that happen. Number one, he's damaged Shimon's field because he's burned down a field, so there's damages. What else has he done? He's been Mechal Shabbos. He lit a fire. So I will say, now listen to this. So what's the halacha? Kimlei b'drabimine. Since he's going to be executed for Shabbos violation, therefore again, he's quote-unquote exempted from financial liability. So Rabbi Nechunya says, the same way that on Shabbos, because there's capital liability, you're exempted from financial liability, so too by Yom Kippur. If he Reuven burns down Shimon's field on Yom Kippur, since he's subject to capital liability, he's exempt from financial liability. Now, I will say, what's the punishment for being Mechalo Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur? Kares. So what do you see that Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says? What do you see from here? He holds that the din of Kimlei b'drabimine applies by Kares as well, which obviously is not reflected in our Mishnah. So, for example, Nechunya ben Akana would say, if a man violates his sister, what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, he's not subject to the knas. Why? Because since he's subject to kares, even when it comes to kares, we say kimle b'derabba mine. Rabbi said, by the way, that phrase means kimle applied to him b'derabba mine. The stronger of the more severe of the two punishments. That's what the phrase itself means. So the Gemara says, so it's incredible. So I just want to point out that again, Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana is interesting. Rabbi Nechunya, everybody accepts the premise, or I should say, everybody accepts the concept of kimle b'derabimine, that when you perform an act which generates dual liability, we impose upon you the more severe of the two liabilities, the more severe of the two punishments. It's just our Mishnah holds that only applies to punishments administered by a court, by a Beis Din. So therefore it doesn't apply to kares, which is administered by the Ribono Shel Olam. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says, Kimlei b'drabimine applies to all punishments, whether they are administered by a human court or they are administered ultimately again by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here we go. Why does Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana hold this way? Right? Where does this come from? Rabbi, listen to this. This is great. We'll say incredible yisugya. Ne'emar ason bidei shamayim, bidei adam, v'ne'emar ason bidei shamayim. So Abaye says like this. It says ason. Then we'll say, what does ason mean? Ason means a tragedy, a tragic event. It says ason bidei adam. So it says ason when it comes to something that is caused by the actions of man, and it says ason bidei shamayim, something caused by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I will say, let me just give you the two psukim, right? What's the ason bidei adam? So this is at the end of Chumash Bereshis, where again, Yosef is in Mitzrayim, has not revealed his identity to the brothers. Remember again, gives them harsh rebuke, and now the brothers need to get food. Yosef tells them, I will not give you food unless, of course, you bring who? Binyamin. So the brothers say to Yaakov Avinu, we have to take Binyamin. Yaakov's response was, Vayomer, Lo yered bini imachem ki achiv meis v'hu levado nishar, ukirahu ason baderech. Yaakov Avinu initially says to his sons, no, Binyamin can't go with you. Binyamin can't go with you, because I'm afraid that if I let him go with you, what's going to happen? An ason, a tragedy is going to occur on the road. So I will say, now we assume that what is Yaakov Avinu referring to? What type of ason? He was afraid something was going to happen to Binyamin. Some type of tragic event was going to occur to Binyamin. That's ason b'dei adam, and it says ason b'dei shamayim. Right? What's the ason? No, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm incorrect. That ason, right? Ason b'dei adam, I will say, is the pasuk that's talking about two people who are fighting, right? So I will say this is talking about where two people are fighting, they end up accidentally hitting a pregnant woman, causing her to miscarry, but the woman herself is not killed. So that's ason bidei adam. That's ason bidei adam. And then it says ason bidei shamayim. That's the case of Yaakov Avinu. That's the case of Yaakov Avinu. Okay, so here we go. Ma'ason ha'amr bidei adam pater min ha'shlumin. So we'll say just like in a case of ason bidei adam, which means I will say if a person does something and it generates dual liability, a death penalty and capital penalty, a financial liability, you're exempted from the financial liability in the face of the capital liability. Af ason ha'amar bidei shamayim pater min ha'tashlumin. So too, Rabosai, when it's an ason bidei shamayim, in other words, when you do something that generates liability in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and financial liability, you'll also be exempted from financial liability. So Rabosai, this is a fascinating drasha. So what Rabbi Yehuda Ben Michal is saying is essentially like this: the word ason is used to describe punishments in the hands of man, and ultimately, again, punishment at the hands of heaven. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, right? Misa, what we call misa bidei adam, misa bidei shamayim. So what's interesting though is it's describing misa bidei adam about what one person does to another, and misa bidei shamayim, that sounds like what Yaakov Avinu is concerned about with Binyamin. So Rabbi Yehuda Ben Michal says, since the same word describes both dynamics, therefore, halacha l'maisa, the concept of kimlei b'derabba minei will apply to both dynamics as well. So anytime a person does something which generates dual liability, a death penalty and financial liability, whether that death penalty is at the hands of a human court or that death penalty is at the hands of heaven, either way, that death penalty exempts you from what? Financial liability. And therefore, I will say, just to keep our eye on the ball, therefore, again, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yehuda Ben Michal. Because our Mishnah says, for example, if a man violates his sister, Isser Kares, our Mishnah said, he's chayav in knas. Why? Because our Mishnah holds the din of kimlei b'drabba minei only applies to when you are liable to a death penalty at the hands of a human court, not to Kares. To which the Gemara says, "Maskif le'Rav Adabar Ava mimay." The Gemara now goes on a tangent, fascinating tangent. Mimay dechi mizdaher lehu Yaakov lebanei al tzinu. I'm sorry, I skipped. No, Maskif Adabar Yaakov mimay dechi masir lehu Yaakov lebanei al tzinu mupachim dibidei shamayim ninu dilma al ari veganvi dibidei adam ninu. Shabbos said, listen to this. Shabbos said, let's take a step back. So now we're saying, let's talk about Yaakov Avinu. So Yaakov Avinu says to his sons, Binyamin's not going with you. It's incredible Gemara. Binyamin's not going with you. Right? Why is Binyamin not going with you? What was the Lashon? Ukirahu ason baderach. I'm concerned there's going to be an ason, a tragedy. Now we're saying, ason in this context means what? Bidei shamayim. So we'll say, what's an example of something bidei shamayim? What's an example of something bidei shamayim? So the Gemara says, Sinim upachim, right? That's true. Sinim upachim. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Sinim upachim. First white line in Rashi. Kar v'chom. I will say, so an example of bidei shamayim would be, a person gets sick and dies as a result of extreme heat or a result of extreme cold. Right? So a person catches a cold or catches a fever because of heat, because of cold. That's an example. Since again the weather is caused by Kadosh Baruch Hu, Tzinem Upachim. Therefore, Misa B'dei Shamayim is an example. It's what we call Tzinem Upachim. Sina means cold, right? Pachim means heat. So because of heat, because of cold, a person gets sick, a person dies. What would be an example? Right. So we'll say that's called. I'm sorry. So what? Let me go back. So mimai techi kamaser lehu Yaakov lebnei atzinim upachem dibidei shamayim ninu dilma al ari veganvi dibidei adam. They will say. So now you're telling me that Yaakov Avinu says to his sons, Binyamin can't go with you. Why can't Binyamin go with you? I'm afraid that he's going to die a misa bidei shamayim. What's an example of misa bidei shamayim? Cold, hot. He's going to catch a fever. He's going to get sick. Maybe Yaakov Avinu was warning his kids. I don't want Binyamin to go with you. Why? Because I'm scared of Misa Bidei Adam. Now I will say, what's an example of Misa Bidei Adam? Aryeh, a lion attack, or Ganvi, or ganvi, right? Thieves, robbers. Now, what's interesting is according to this definition of misa b'dei adam, misa b'dei adam doesn't necessarily have to mean death at the hands of another person. What does misa b'dei adam mean? We'll call it death in the normal course of events. Right? A lion attack is called misa b'dei adam. So maybe Yaakov was warning them about that. He was scared about that. So the Gemara says, Atu Yaakov aha nishar, aha lo isar. Shabbos said it doesn't make sense that Yaakov was only afraid of one thing, not afraid of something else. Yaakov al kol mili asar. Shabbos say bepashtos, Yaakov is afraid of all of these things happening to me. In other words, what the Gemara is saying is, why do you define ason in the context of Yaakov Avinu in a limited scope of misa b'dei shamayim? Bepashtos, Yaakov Avinu is scared of losing his son. And how is he scared of losing his son? How is he scared of it? Both b'dei adam and b'dei shamayim. We'll say, the Gemara says, by the way, so we'll say, now this is exciting. It's a tangent on a tangent, which goes on a tangent. Right? We'll say, remember again, how did this whole sugya start? By the way, our Mishnah doesn't go according to Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, because Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana says that ultimately, again, Kinli Midrabine applies even Misa de Shamayim. We're doing enough from Yaakov Avinu. Let's talk about Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu was warning his sons, don't take Binyamin because I'm afraid he's going to die Misa de Shamayim because there's a son. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, tangent on the tangent on the tangent. Yaakov Avinu was only worried about Misa de Shamayim, not worried about Misa de Adam. No, Yaakov Avinu was worried about everything. Oh, by the way, Sinim upachim is misa b'dei shamayim. Listen to this, Rabbi say, get ready. Sinim upachim mis b'dei shamayim minhu. Rabbi say, now here's what's interesting. Sinim upachim means a person gets sick as a result of the heat, as a result of the cold. Is that cold mis? And let's say a person dies as a result of that. Is that cold misa b'dei shamayim? V'atanya, Rabbi say, get ready for this. Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitsinim upachim. Yet we learned everything is in the hands of heaven except for cold and heat. And I both say, now what does that mean? Look at Rashi. Chutz mitzinu apachim shepamim shebam b'pshia. What does Rabbi say? When it comes to the weather, you could take measures to avoid sickness, right? If it's very cold outside, then what? Wear a coat. You don't wear a coat. You don't say, Ribono shel olam, what are you doing to me? What do you mean? Put on a coat, right? Not everything is a theological crisis. In other words, so we'll say, so at the end of the day, the Gemara says, or it's too hot, so don't be makbid to wear your 15 pairs of tzitzis, right? So Lemaisa again, there are things that a person could do to ameliorate the effects of extreme weather. So the Gemara says, we say, Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim. Everything is in the hands of heaven, except for cold and for heat. Shene'emar, the Gemara quotes the pasuk, Sinim upachim b'derech ikesh, shomer nafsho yirchak mehem. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk from Mishlei, literally again, cold and heat b'derech ikesh comes from a windy road, a twisted road. Shomer nafsho yirchak mehem. So we'll say, so Shlomo Melech is conveying a deeper idea, but for our purposes, shomer nafsho yirchak mehem means a person who watches himself, can distance himself from the deleterious effects of these items. The point over here is that halacha lamaisa, you could protect yourself against sinim upachim. So why does the Gemara call this misa b'dei shamayim? Just the opposite. This is called b'dei adam. So the Gemara says, I just want to point out something very interesting. If you took a look at Rashi says over here something really incredible. Tosas, Hakol b'dei shamayim, so much to say on this sugya. Hopefully we're going to get to it today. Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitzinu upachim. Rashi says, V'hadar mina li'olam al yamod adam b'makom sakana al mayachal lishmar atzmo min ha'paronos. V'chein kirnatoi da'asro la'avar tachtav hasam min ha'pshir yachal lishmar atzmo dahav vaday shebiyad lahamis atzmo aval kishmavir alav min ha'shmayim ba'ones i efshar lishmar aval tzinim upachim li'olam al yavo alav ba'ones in ratzilizar. So Tosas says something very interesting. What does it mean when it says Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim? Apparently what Tosas is saying is the elements is technically something you could protect yourself from. Now, is there the types of extreme weather from which you can protect yourself from? Of course, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about, in general, Tosas is saying, the way that the weather works is, you could always take proactive steps to ameliorate or to prevent the deleterious effects of the weather. That's what it means. Hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim. If you skip away to the last two lines of Tosas, Tosa says, but 1 second. But 1 second, we have another phrase in Chazal. What's the other phrase in Chazal? Everything is in the hands of heaven except for Yira Shamayim. In other words, Rabbi say, the Ribono Shel Olam controls everything in this world, except for your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What about that phrase? In other words, here the Gemara says, Hakol bidei Shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim, which means everything is in the hands of heaven, except how you go ahead and prepare yourself for the elements, for weather, which sounds like even Yira Shamayim is in the hands of Hashem. But yet the Gemara says, Akol b'dei Shamayim chutz mi Yira Shamayim. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Ein inyano likan. The hasam kai ala vlad b'may imo, shegozrim im yehei ani o asher giba or chalash tipesh o chacham, avat tzadik v'rashalo, v'hacham mayri b'ma'oros haba'os ala adam. To which Tosa says the phrases are not contradictory. And I will say here, the Gemara is talking about, Hakol b'dei Shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim means, there are things that happen in the world that I cannot control. Things that happen in the world that I cannot control. So the Gemara says, a lot of stuff happens in day-to-day life that you simply cannot control. What are the things that are absolutely in your control? How the weather impacts you. Okay, it's good to know. Right? That's what I can control in this world. How the weather impacts me. If I overheat, if I'm not right, if I'm too overdressed for the heat, too underdressed for the cold, that I control. Everything else in my day-to-day life, I may not control. The Gemara Maseches Brachos that says, "Hakol b'dei Shamayim chutz mi Yira Shamayim" is talking about the nature of my life. In other words, or the nature of my identity. The Gemara says, if I'm rich or if I'm poor, that's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Just like if I'm taller, if I'm short, that's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Good looking, not good looking, that's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Smart, not so smart, that's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara says, however, Yira Shamayim, my spiritual identity, who I am as a spiritual being, that is in my own hands. So it's describing two different states. When it says, that's talking about the pre-programmed qualities of me, that's decided by Hashem, with the exception of my spiritual identity. That's my choice. The Gemara here is talking about stuff that occurs in everyday life. So stuff that occurs in everyday life, that's in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the one thing you control? How you relate to the weather. How you relate to the weather. So we'll say, now let's go right there. There's more to say, we're going to come back. There's much more to say, so I'm going to say it for the last couple minutes of this year. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Visu irya, the Gemara says, Visu arye, the gan b'bidei shamayim ninu. I will say, is that true? That if a person chas v'shalom dies at the hands of a lion or thieves, that's called bidei adam? The both say, get ready for this. Amar Rav Yosef, v'chin tani Rabbi Chia, miyom shecharav beis hamikdash. The both say, you heard this phrase we just learned? From the day the beis hamikdash was destroyed. I will say, Erev Shabbos Chazon. Erev Shabbos Chazon. 2 days before Tisha B'Av. Right? Really, today is the calendrical date of Erev Tisha B'Av. Today is the 8th of Av. I will say, we're learning a Gemara about Churban beis hamikdash. Since the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, even though we don't have a Sanhedrin, and in the absence of a Sanhedrin, we don't have the ability to go ahead and adjudicate capital cases. Right? There's no administering of a death penalty without the Sanhedrin. Listen to this. Arba misos lo bitlu. I will say the 4 capital punishments that Beis Din would administer are not batal. How so? So the Gemara says, lo bitlu. Ha bitlu. What do you think? They're not batal. They are batal. If the Sanhedrin is not in session, Sanhedrin doesn't sit, you can't administer a death penalty. To which the Gemara says, Ella Amadeus, Ella, this is incredible Gemara, Din Arba Misos Lo Batlu. I will say what it means is that even though there is not a Beis Din to go ahead and administer these death penalties, ultimately the Ribono Shel Olam has different ways of administering them. For example, Mishin is Chayiv Skila. Let's say Chas v'Shalom, someone did something that made them subject to skila. So we'll say, how does HaKadosh Baruch Hu carry out that penalty? O nofil min agag, a person will fall off a roof. O chayud dor saso, or they'll be pounced on by and killed by a wild animal. And I will say, part of skila, Rashi explains over, look at the top, Rashi, nofil min agag, doma l'nisko, shedochvin oso mi beis ha-skila la'aretz. So I will say, the first part of skila is, they would throw someone off a high roof or a high ledge. The goal was the person should die from impact. Only if they didn't die from impact would they then be stoned. So therefore, if a person did something that they're subject to skila, the Rebbe has different ways of carrying out skila. Person falls off a roof, or I will say, how is it being pounced on an animal? Because when an animal attacks someone, Rashi says, the animal throws the person to the ground. So you see the imagery over here is the person being thrown to the ground like skila. Mishin is chayev sreifa. If a person is chayev sreifa, o nofel b'dleika, person falls into a fire, o nachash makisha, they're bitten by a snake. Because the idea over here is that the venom has like a burning sensation. Mishin is chayiv hariga, somebody was subject to beheading. O nimsar l'malchus, they're given over to the government, because often, again, historically, the monarchy would behead people. O listim bo'im alav, or they're attacked by robbers. Umishin is chayiv chenek, if somebody was subject to strangulation. O tovea bahar, they drown in the water. O meis bisrunchi, or they die because of srunchi. Rashi points over here, srunchi is askira, was this type of disease where the pathway constricts and a person ultimately dies of suffocation. So we'll say, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? That both a lion attack, and being attacked by thieves is both a form of misa. Both of them are considered to be a form of misa b'dei shamayim, not misa b'dei adam. To which the Gemara says, you're right, ela efoch, switch it around. Arye v'ganvi b'dei shamayim, sinim upachim b'dei adam. So we'll say, change it around. You're right, go ahead and change it to Arye and Ganvi being attacked by a lion or by thieves is a form of misa b'dei shamayim, but ultimately sinim upachim, ultimately again is considered to be misa b'dei adam. I will say, if you take a quick look at Tosis says over, look at Tosis din dalad misos, go about 3-4 lines into Tosis. Aval kasha dechazin, look what Tosis says. I will say kasha dechazinon kama avayonim va'ovdei kochavim avodos kochavim shemesim amitasam. So I will say Tosis asked the $1 million question. So if there really is still a concept of Misa B'dei Shamayim, how can we see so many sinners die a peaceful sin? They don't die Misa B'dei Shamayim. Right? I was going to say, this is embedded in a much more profound theological question, which is, if indeed, even though there's no Beis Mikdash and there's no Sanhedrin, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu carries out din, so then why in the world we often don't see din? What's the pshat? So what's the good Tosa says? V'yishlomar, both say, get ready for this Gemara. V'yishlomar, da'ayidei tshuva, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mekel, u'lepamim mocha legamrei, o zuchus tolalo ve'eno nifra mimeno b'chayev. So we'll say, look what Tosa answers. Tosa says, 1 second, how do you know who did tshuva and who didn't do tshuva? Right? You don't know what's in a person's heart. So sometimes I see someone and I say, Russia, or Akum, terrible, you should be subject to the mitzvahs b'dei shamayim. So Tosa says, you don't know who did tshuva, you know who didn't do tshuva. And the power of tshuva is such that even if a person is subject to mitzvah b'dei shamayim, tshuva has the ability to go ahead and turn around everything. Or sometimes a person has a particular schos. And in the merit of that particular schos, ultimately, again, they are spared from the ravages of Misa B'dei Shamayim. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right there. Rava Amar Tam Rabbi Yehuda Ben Akana Mehacha. So I'll say back to Rabbi Yehuda Ben Akana. So remember again, Rabbi Yehuda Ben Akana holds. I have one more piece that I want to share with you today, which we're going to save 5 minutes for. So we're going to go right there, 3 minutes, then do a piece for 5 minutes. Rava says like this. Rava says there's another reason for Rabbi Yehuda Ben Akana, right? Why he holds the Kilim Drabminei applies even to Misa B'dei Shamayim. So the Gemara says, Mehacha. V'imhalim ya'alimu ama'aretz esinei min ha'ishahu b'sidam mizaro l'molech v'samti aniyas panai ba'isho mishpachto v'chrasi oso. So we'll say, the pasuk over is actually talking about if you see someone going ahead and worshiping Avodah Zarah and you don't do anything, you fail to act. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you fail to act, I will act. I will literally again turn my face to this person and to his family, and I will cut him off. Amra Torah, Kares Shali Kamisa Shalachem. So Rabbi say, what's interesting over here, essentially Kadosh Baruch Hu was saying, if you don't do your job, I'll do my job. What's our job? Our job is to execute if there's Avodah Zarah. Kadosh Baruch Hu says, if you don't do your job, I'll do it. I'll give Kares. So the pasuk itself is equating the punishment of Hashem to the punishment of a Beis Din. So the Gemara says, my kares is like your misa. Ma misa shalachem pater min hatashlumin. Just like your misa, there's the concept of kimlei b'drabimine, af kares sheli pater min hatashlumin. So to my kares, ultimately, again, is pater from tashlumin. Incredible. My vein Rava la'abaye. So we'll say now we have two interpretations of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana's svara. So what's the chiluk between Rava and Abaye? To which the Gemara says, my Gemara la'abaye, ika benayu zar sha'achal truma. Rabbi said, good nafkamina would be the case of a non-Kohen who eats truma. So Rabbi says, so remember again, if a non-Kohen eats truma, so listen to this, la'abaye pater, ula Rava chayiv. According to Abaye, he'll be pater. According to Rava, he'll be chayiv. Why? Look at Rashi. Zar sha'achal truma, b'mezit v'hu b'misa b'dei shamayim v'lo b'kares. So Rabbi says, now we're introducing something new. There's something that's called misa b'dei shamayim. Now I will say, we often use the terms misa b'dei shamayim and kares synonymously. But in fact, they're two different things. Misa b'dei shamayim means exactly that, death at the hands of heaven. Who does it affect? The perpetrator. Kares is a more severe penalty. Kares affects the perpetrator and also potentially chas v'shalom affects his children. If a non-Kohen, a zar, purposely eats truma, he is subject to misa b'dei shamayim, but not kares. So watch this, Rabbi say. According to Abaye says, Abaye's lashon of ason includes kares and misa b'dei shamayim. Therefore, according to Abaye, or Abaye's interpretation, according to Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, kimlei b'drabimine applies to both kares and misa b'dei shamayim. Whereas according to Rava, ultimately again, kimlei b'drabimine only applies to kares, doesn't apply to misa b'dei shamayim. So the Gemara says, Abaye, pater, is that true that according to Abaye, you'll be pater? B'hamar Rav Chisda Moder Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, begonev chelbo shel chaveiro v'achlo. Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana holds that if you steal the chelev of your friend and you eat it, so almost you've done two things. You've done an act of theft, and now you've eaten chelev, which is also subject to kares. Shu chayiv shekvar nischayiv b'gneva kodem sheba lidei iser chelev. And I will say that's not a case of kimlei b'drabimine. Why? Kimlei b'drabimine only applies when there's simultaneity. But over here, you stole and then you ate, so you're going to be chayiv both. I'm sorry, the moment that you pick it up, you acquire it, therefore that's theft. But you're not liable for chelev consumption until when? Until you eat it. It says like in so to Rabbi Osai, by the case of the non-Kohen who goes ahead and eats truma, why don't we say the same thing? That Allah Chalamaysa, the moment you picked it up, that's when you're chayiv for theft. But the actual liability for truma consumption doesn't occur until when? Until you eat it. So I'll say, I'm going to leave you in the middle of this right now. We're going to pick up with this tomorrow, Mir Hashem. So I'm leaving a bit off the cliffhanger because I have to share with you something that is mamish life altering. So I will say, there is an incredible. So again, I know, I apologize. I'm stopping literally right in the middle of this. So again, we're stopping in the middle of the nafkamina between Abaye and Rava in their interpretations, ultimately of Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana. I'm leaving you on this cliffhanger. We'll come back. I promise we'll get resolution tomorrow. So I will say, let me use the last 3 minutes for a beautiful idea. So remember again, we saw the concept of hakol b'dei shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim. Everything is in the hands of heaven except for tzinim upachim. Literally again, cold, right? Heat and cold. So remember again, Tosas asked, but what about the Gemara that says hakol b'dei shamayim chutz miyira shamayim? So Tosas gave an interesting answer, right? What was Tosas' approach? Two different things, not contradictory. So I was saying, in the Sefer Bina Le'itim, so I saw this quoted in the Kerem Shlomo. He says something amazing. I was saying, listen to this. He says, Shlomo HaMelech says, and it's based on the pasuk. Tzinim upachim b'derech ikesh, shomer nafsho yirchak mehem. A person should distance himself from tzinim upachim. So I was saying, so the Bina Le'itim says, what is Shlomo HaMelech trying to teach us? Right, Shlomo was like a Jewish mother, right? Go out with your coat, right? Make sure you take your coat. Don't go out with wet hair. Like, what is Shlomo needs to teach? This is like the extent of Solomonic wisdom, that be careful of cold and hot, heat and cold weather. So what is Shlomo trying to convey? Rabbi said, listen to this. Get ready for this. The Torah contains positive commandments and prohibitions. Lemitzvos asay, tzarich ha'adam lisorer ba bechamimos o bislavos. I will say, when it comes to mitzvos asay, what's my obligation? You need chamimos, heat, and hislavos, and excitement. Because to do a mitzvos asay, you have to move yourself. You need inertia, right? In order to move myself to perform positive commandments, there has to be a heat, right? I have to be hot. I have to have hislavos, I have to have an excitement. However, for prohibitions, I will say, what do you need? Nitzrach tzad kariros. You need to be cold, right? Because for prohibitions, what do you need to do? Cool down in action. In action. Sheisbatel me'it me'oso his orus l'ra. So we'll say, but what happens in life? What happens in life? Get ready for this. Amdam hayitzahara mefata umisis la adam lishtamish ba'kariros v'chamimos lahevach. What happens in life, Rabbi was saying? Often, I get my hot-cold settings mixed up. See, Rabbi said the way it's supposed to work is the hot setting, right? The heat, the hislavos, the excitement, the zrizos, that has to go towards mitzvahs. That's where my heat setting needs to be. The cold setting needs to go towards mitzvahs. Losa, say, averis, cool down, don't do. The Yetzer Hara often gets me to mix up my settings. So suddenly I'm going to say, when it comes to things I have to do, I'm cool, I'm laid back, I'm lackadaisical, I'm unexcited, uninspired, there's no zrizos. Conversely, but when it comes to doing an avera, I'm on it. Right? I'm all in. I'm all in, and there's an excitement, and there's a hislavos, and I move myself to do it. Ukineged zeh. So they will say, this becomes the avoda in life. Because of time, I'll just say the rest outside. So the Kerem Shlomo says something so beautiful. He says, quoting the Sefer Bina Le'itim, he says, this is what it means when we say, Hakol bidei shamayim chutz mitzinin upachim. They will say, everything is up to you. Everything is in the hands of heaven, except for how you use your cold and your hot settings in life. See, Rabosai, what I determine is my personalistic spiritual temperature. When it comes to the performance of mitzvos, when it comes to serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how do I do it? Do I do it laid back, lackadaisical, without zrizos, the cold setting? Am I the tzina? Am I the cold Jew? Or am I parchim Jew? Am I hot? Am I excited? When it comes to avoiding averos, or when it comes to averos, am I using my cold setting or my hot setting? Hakol bidei shamayim chutz mitzinim upachim teaches me that halacha lemaisa, at the end of the day, everything is in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, except how you use your cold and hot settings in life. What do you get excited about? What do you use your zrizos for? And conversely, when are you laid back, dispassionate, and disinterested? And by the way, according to this approach, it's not a contradiction. It's the same thing. Hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyir shamayim, and hakol bidei shamayim chutz mitzimim upachim is the same exact teaching of Chazal. And I will say we learn this in the same line that says, Miyom shechara beis hamikdash. Because I will say one of the ways in which we will be zocheh me'eretz Hashem to get our beloved mikdash back is to go ahead and regulate our tzilim upachim settings. Is kudol b'dei shamayim chutz miyir shamayim, is to begin to use that incredible zrizos and that incredible hislavos for all the right things, and stop using it chas v'sholem for things which derail us in life. Rabbi Osai, shkayach and good Shabbos.